The US Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has died following a brief and sudden illness at the age of 71. His office has released a statement saying he died on Saturday evening. Senator Graham's family appreciates prayers at this time and asks for privacy during this incredibly difficult period, it said. Lindsey Graham was a prominent Republican senator from South Carolina. He was in Kyiv just this week speaking with President Zelensky on how to ramp up economic pressure on Russia. We can speak now to Scott Lucas, Professor of American Politics at the University College Dublin. Hello to you. Really a shocking news this, I suppose. He was just in Kyiv just on Friday, I see, Senator Graham. Just talk to us about him and what he's achieved in his long career.
Okay, so Lindsey Graham was one of the stalwarts of the Republicans in the Senate and had been for most of his career an establishment Republican since he entered the chamber in 2002. But what really shifted Graham, indeed, of course, what shifted the Republican Party, was that election of Donald Trump in 2016. Graham stood in that 2016 campaign, tried to get the Republican nomination. Donald Trump belittled him, insulted him, humiliated him, even gave out his phone number on air. But rather than setting himself up against Trump, Graham very much swung behind Trump. He very much an ally of Trump, an enabler of Trump in terms of repackaging Trump's views to try to make them acceptable when Trump crossed the line. There were certain moments when Graham would come out and say, look, maybe, this has gone too far, notably after the Capitol attack in January 6, 2021. But by and large, both in Trump's first term and in Trump's second term, Graham became a marker of how Trump took over the Republican Party because, Graham, only a few weeks after that Capitol attack, and having said this was unacceptable, said, well, Donald Trump is the future of the Republican Party.
Yes, extraordinarily sort of political manoeuvres there, really, everything that you've just talked through. What about his character then? What would that have been in terms of his decision to get behind Trump even after that sort of public ridicule that you talked about?
I mean, for those people who I think, were supportive of Graham or simply gave this a kind reading, they would say he was very flexible. He was very much a political maneuverer. They would also point to the fact that he had certain, lines which weren't shaken. He was, as you mentioned, in Kyiv because he was a strong supporter of Ukraine's defense against Russian invasion. He was very much hawkish in his foreign policy views, very much supported not only the war in Iran, but putting American ground troops in. Those who are not so charitable to Graham would simply say that he shifted with the wind. And when the political wind was that MAGA and Trump was in the ascendancy, rather than trying to hold ground against that, because it did damage the Republican Party, Graham became an enabler of that shift all the way until his final days.
We've just been looking at images of him meeting President Zelensky in Kyiv, and as I said, he was there just on Friday on another visit. That was an issue very close to his heart, wasn't it, as well? He really did seem to go to Kyiv many times during this war.
Yeah, I think one way of explaining that is before this big shift that Graham took in terms of supporting, propping up Trump, he was an ally of John McCain, the longtime senator from Arizona, the Republican presidential candidate in 2008. And McCain was a very strong voice in terms of supporting Ukraine against the Russians all the way back to 2014 when the Russians seized Crimea, when they tried to split Ukraine by supporting separatists in the east of the country. And that didn't change. That didn't change with Trump coming into office. Graham was still very much, we have to stand firm against the Russian invasion. The issue, I think, with Graham is that he would delay, however, in some of those key issues of that support. So for quite some time, in fact, ever since Trump took office in 2025, Graham said, look, we're going to push a sweeping sanctions package on Russia that goes well beyond what the administration does. And indeed, he reiterated that just last week when he went to Kyiv. But that sanctions package had not appeared. And again, those who would be not so charitable would say that Graham was he was careful. He felt that if he went too far on Ukraine, he might set himself up against Trump.
We just had a statement through from Israel's defense minister saying he's deeply saddened by the passing of US Senator Lindsey Graham, who stood with Israel in its most difficult moments, the statement reads. He was a staunch supporter of Israel, wasn't he? Talk us through that relationship.
Yeah, Graham was, like many U.S. Congressional representatives, very much a staunch supporter of Israel throughout his 24 years in the Senate. But this became, of course, very marked after Hamas's mass killing inside Israel in October 2003, and then Israel's mass killing inside Gaza that continues to this day. And despite, I think criticism of Israel in terms of what some saw as a disproportionate response, Graham was always that this was completely justified, that Israel was standing up against the threat of Hamas, indeed standing up against the threat of what he would characterize as extreme Islam. And that line intersected with his belief in terms of the war on Iran. He saw the Iranian regime as being this existential threat to Israel. So he went well beyond the Trump administration. When the Trump administration ceasefire in April, Graham was not happy. Graham had wanted U.S. ground troops to be put in. And he had the war in Iran continued, and we had this limbo that we're in right now. Whether he would have used that as an issue to distance himself from the Trump folks, we can only speculate.
Despite any differences, he was very influential, wasn't he? It's fair to say.
Oh, yeah. He's absolutely influential. As I said, I think the big thing about Lindsey Graham today, and first and foremost, we have to remember that a man has died. There will be friends and family who will be affected by this. But Lindsey Graham's death at this time is another catalyst in what is a battle between the Trumpists and the establishment Republicans for control of the party, including in the Senate. Because remember, we still don't know what has happened to the former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was a bulwark of that establishment. Now, the establishment Republicans in Trump's first term believed they could sort of maneuver Trump. They could coexist with them to get what they wanted, like tax cuts, like packing, conservatives onto courts, including the Supreme Court. And Graham was very much part of that. But Graham went beyond McConnell. He actually, I think, in a sense, was seen as being very obedient to Trump in the end. And that meant the question was, if this became a split in the Republican Party, would Graham stand with the establishment or would he stand with the Trumpists? And right now, I think you are seeing what will be a battle for the soul of the Republican Party in the Senate and beyond. It just probably will not happen with Graham and McConnell, which at some point means there is a changing of the guard that will take place, whichever direction that means for the GOP.
OK. Well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. I really do appreciate it. That's Professor Scott Lucas from University College Dublin. Thank you.